NATO defense ministers to meet as fighting in eastern Ukraine indicates start of Russian offensive. NATO defense ministers are to begin a two-day meeting in Brussels on February 14 after a gathering in Germany of the so-called Ramstein group composed of dozens of countries that have been providing arms to Kyiv. The Ramstein group is expected to discuss possible further military aid as Ukraine calls for its allies to provide fighter jets and long-range missiles. NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said the issue of aircraft is to be discussed at the NATO meeting, in which Ukrainian Defense Minister Oleksiy Reznikov will take part. Stoltenberg on February 13 backed reports from local officials that a major new Russian offensive had begun. He said the Western military alliance saw no sign whatsoever that Russian President Vladimir Putin is preparing for peace. What we see is President Putin and Russia still wanting to control Ukraine, Stoltenberg said. We see how they are sending more troops, more weapons, more capabilities. Kyiv has been anticipating a much broader offensive that could not only target the Donbas regions of Donetsk and Luhansk in the east, but also the Kharkiv region in the northeast and Zaporizhia in the southeast. The reality is we have seen the start of a Russian offensive, already because we see now what Russia does now, President Putin does now, is to send thousands and thousands more troops, accepting a very high rate of casualty, Stoltenberg said. Russian forces have been engaged in an offensive in eastern Ukraine for months as they try to capture strategic towns and cities, including the battered city of Bakhmut in Ukraine's Donetsk region, which endured heavy artillery fire on February 13. Capturing Bakhmut would give Russian forces a new foothold in the Donetsk region and a rare victory after several months of setbacks. In his comments on February 13, Stoltenberg said NATO would increase targets for the stockpiling of ammunition as Kyiv burns through shells much faster than Western countries can produce them. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said in his evening address on February 13 that he met during the day with military commanders to discuss the defense of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions as well as the south of Ukraine, including Odessa. Constant attention is paid to the supply of weapons, ammunition, and everything that adds strength and stability to our soldiers, he said, but provided no further details. Valery Zaluzhny, the commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces, said he held a phone call on the eve of the meeting with NATO Supreme Commander in Europe Christopher Kyiv. We discussed the issue of supplying international military aid to Ukraine and training our units on the territory of partner countries, Zaluzhny said. A statement from the Ukrainian Defense Ministry said he shared assessments of the operational situation on the front of the Russian-Ukrainian war and plans for further actions. Zaluzhny expressed his gratitude for Kyiv's deep understanding of the situation and significant efforts to bring our victory closer, the statement added. Russia's playbook, U.S. diplomat says Washington is deeply concerned about alleged plot to destabilize Moldova. The United States is deeply concerned about reports of a Russian plot to destabilize Moldova, U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Karen Donfried said on February 15 in an interview with RFE/RL. I think we are, all of us, all too familiar with Russia's playbook, Donfried said. We've seen what Russia has done in many places, including Moldova, including Ukraine, including Georgia. The list could continue. Moldovan President Maya Sandu earlier this week spoke of the alleged plot, saying she had received documents from Ukrainian intelligence services that showed Moscow was planning actions against her country. The United States has been in very close contact with our Moldovan partners during what is a critical time, and we strongly support the leadership of Moldovan President Maya Sandu, Donfried said. She noted that Moldova is in a vulnerable geographical position, with a war in neighboring Ukraine and the challenge of the breakaway Transnistria region, where Russia maintains troops. While Moldova faces these difficulties, it has the leadership of Sandu, who has shown a deep commitment to a reform agenda and the desire to move forward on the path of creating a stronger democracy in Moldova, Donfried said. Sandu currently faces a political crisis prompted by the resignation of Natalia Gavrilita, who last week stepped down as prime minister, triggering the resignation of the entire cabinet. Sandu immediately appointed former Interior Minister Doran Reznikov to replace Gavrilita, whose 18 months in power were overshadowed by the conflict in Ukraine, which has at times threatened to spill over into Moldova. Reznikov is expected to propose a new government to parliament on February 16. Sandu has said its mission will include accelerating a cleanup of the justice system and the fight against corruption and economic growth. Donfried said the United States is very supportive of the new government coming in and the renewed commitment to reform. A strategic dialogue between Washington and Chisinau has been very productive and constructive, and the United States will continue to coordinate very closely with Moldova not only in terms of immediate difficulties related to energy and economic pressures, but also in terms of reforms, she added. We will continue to be there with Moldova at a very critical time, Donfried said. Estonian authorities said on February 15 that they had cancelled the residence permit of pro-Kremlin activist Sergei Chalin and deported him to Russia, saying he poses a threat to the Baltic nations' state security and social order. Chalin is currently in St. Petersburg, Estonian media reports say. Chalin, who is stateless, resided for many years in Tallinn, where he led pro-Russian groups that support Moscow's policies, including the annexation of Ukraine's Crimea and the Kremlin's support of pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine. Kremlin will not invite media from unfriendly countries to Putin's speech. The Kremlin will not invite reporters from countries that Russia has deemed unfriendly to President Vladimir Putin's address to the Federal Assembly next week. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said on February 15 that only media representing friendly countries will be accredited to the February 21 event. Foreign media from unfriendly countries will only be able to report on the speech while watching the live broadcast, Peskov said. More than 60 countries, including the United States, EU member states, Britain, Canada, and Japan, have been declared unfriendly by Russia for imposing or supporting sanctions in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine.